In the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where political fortune shifted like shadows at dusk, a young diplomatic secretary named Niccolò Machiavelli observed a truth that would echo through centuries: the art of argument is not merely about being right, but about wielding discourse as a weapon of influence. The year was 1503, and Machiavelli had just witnessed Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, soon to become Pope Julius II, systematically dismantle the arguments of three seasoned ambassadors through nothing more than calculated verbal maneuvering. The scene unfolded in the papal apartments, where tensions ran high over territorial disputes between the Papal States and the Republic of Florence. The Florentine ambassadors had come armed with legal precedents, historical claims, and moral arguments about the righteousness of their cause. They spoke eloquently of justice, of ancient treaties, of the natural rights of republics to govern their own affairs. Yet within an hour, they found themselves backing down, their confidence shattered, their arguments turned against them like swords wrested from their own hands. Machiavelli, tasked with recording the proceedings, watched in fascination as the cardinal employed what would later become recognizable as masterful psychological manipulation. The cardinal never once raised his voice, never resorted to insults or obvious intimidation. Instead, he used the ambassadors' own words against them, redirected their strongest points into weaknesses, and gradually shifted the entire framework of the discussion until the Florentines found themselves arguing for positions they had never intended to take. This observation became the cornerstone of Machiavelli's understanding of power dynamics in human discourse. He realized that victory in argument, whether in the political arena, the merchant's marketplace, or the scholar's study, rarely went to those with the most facts or the most righteous cause. Instead, it belonged to those who understood the deeper mechanics of human psychology, who could manipulate the very structure of conversation itself. The first strategy Machiavelli identified was what he privately termed the mirror of contradiction. He watched as Cardinal della Rovere took the ambassador's argument about Florentine independence and reflected it back in a subtly altered form. When they spoke of their right to self-governance, he agreed wholeheartedly, but then wondered aloud why, if they were truly independent, they needed papal permission for anything at all. Surely, he suggested with apparent innocence, truly independent states would simply act without seeking approval? The ambassadors found themselves in the impossible position of either claiming they didn't need papal approval, which would be seen as defiance, or admitting that their independence was limited, which undermined their entire position. This technique works by accepting your opponent's premise while extending it to its logical extreme, forcing them to either abandon their original position or defend an untenable extension of it. The beauty lies in its apparent reasonableness. You're not contradicting them directly, you're simply following their logic to its natural conclusion. When someone argues for individual freedom, you can agree enthusiastically and wonder why they support any government regulations at all. When they argue for government oversight, you can nod approvingly and ask if they think the government should regulate every aspect of personal life. The opponent finds themselves trapped between their stated position and its uncomfortable implications. The psychological power of this strategy stems from a fundamental human need for consistency. People resist being seen as illogical or contradictory, so when faced with the logical extremes of their position, they often retreat rather than defend what appears to be an inconsistent stance. The key is to present the extension as if you're genuinely trying to understand their position, not as if you're attacking it. This maintains your credibility while forcing them into an increasingly defensive position. Machiavelli observed that this technique was particularly effective against passionate advocates who had become emotionally invested in their positions. The more fervent their belief, the more likely they were to accept the extended logic rather than admit their original position was flawed. Cardinal della Rovere had identified this weakness in the Florentine ambassadors, whose pride in their republic's independence made them vulnerable to having that very pride turned against them. The second strategy emerged from another diplomatic encounter Machiavelli witnessed between Cesare Borgia and the Duke of Urbino. Borgia, faced with accusations of treachery and broken promises, employed what Machiavelli came to call the burden of proof reversal. Rather than defending his actions, Borgia calmly asked the Duke to prove that promises between princes carried the same weight as promises between merchants or common citizens. He suggested that perhaps the Duke was applying inappropriate standards to political relationships, and wondered if the Duke could provide historical examples where absolute adherence to every diplomatic agreement had served a state's interests better than strategic flexibility. This technique transforms defense into offense by questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying your opponent's attack. Instead of answering accusations, you challenge their right to make such accusations based on the standards they're applying. The brilliance lies in shifting the burden of proof from yourself to your accuser. Suddenly, they must defend not just their specific claims, but the entire framework that makes their claims valid. When accused of inconsistency, you don't deny the inconsistency, you question whether consistency is actually a virtue in the context they're discussing. When accused of being unreasonable, you ask them to define reasonable behavior and explain why their definition should apply to your situation. When accused of causing harm, you wonder aloud whether their concern for harm extends to the harm caused by inaction or alternative courses of action. The psychological effectiveness comes from the way this technique exploits the human tendency to assume shared frameworks of meaning. Most arguments proceed on the assumption that both parties agree on basic standards of evaluation: what counts as evidence, what constitutes fairness, what principles should guide behavior. By questioning these assumptions, you force your opponent to defend foundational beliefs they've never had to articulate, moving them far from their original position and into unfamiliar philosophical territory where they're likely to be less confident. Borgia's execution of this strategy was masterful because he never appeared to be evading responsibility. He seemed genuinely curious about the standards being applied to him, as if he were a scholar seeking understanding rather than a politician avoiding accountability. This appearance of intellectual honesty made his questions seem legitimate rather than evasive, forcing the Duke to engage with them seriously rather than dismissing them as obvious misdirection. The third strategy Machiavelli observed was perhaps the most subtle and, therefore, the most devastating. During a heated council meeting about military appropriations, he watched an elderly Florentine senator named Lorenzo Strozzi systematically dismantle his opponent's arguments through what appeared to be simple clarification but was actually sophisticated linguistic manipulation. Strozzi would listen carefully to his opponent's statements, then repeat them back with slight modifications that changed their meaning while appearing to merely restate them more clearly. When a younger senator argued that Florence needed to increase military spending to defend against foreign threats, Strozzi nodded thoughtfully and said, "So you're suggesting we should prioritize military expansion over the welfare of our citizens?" The young senator protested that this wasn't what he had said, but Strozzi appeared confused. "But surely military spending means less money for grain subsidies, for public works, for the institutions that serve our people's daily needs? I'm simply trying to understand the trade-offs you're proposing." This technique, which Machiavelli termed the friendly clarification, works by subtly reframing your opponent's position in terms that are technically accurate but carry different emotional and logical implications. You're not misquoting them, you're interpreting their words in a way that highlights negative consequences or uncomfortable associations they hadn't explicitly acknowledged. The power of this strategy lies in its appearance of helpfulness. You seem to be assisting the discussion by making positions clearer and more explicit. Your opponents can't easily object without appearing to be the ones creating confusion or trying to hide something. Yet with each clarification, you're actually shifting the terms of debate in your favor, forcing them to defend positions they never quite intended to take. Strozzi's mastery of this technique was evident in how he maintained a tone of genuine puzzlement whenever his opponents objected to his restatements. He never seemed to be deliberately misrepresenting their views; instead, he appeared to be a careful listener who was simply drawing out the logical implications of their words. This made it difficult for them to attack his interpretations without seeming defensive or evasive. The psychological mechanism at work involves the human tendency to accept authoritative restatements of our own positions, especially when those restatements come from someone who appears to be listening carefully and engaging seriously with our ideas. We want to be understood, so when someone reflects our thoughts back to us, we're inclined to accept their interpretation as valid even when it emphasizes aspects we hadn't considered central to our argument. Moreover, this technique exploits the social dynamics of public debate. In a group setting, observers often remember the last version of a position they heard rather than the original statement. By consistently providing his own interpretations of his opponent's arguments, Strozzi was effectively controlling how those positions would be remembered and evaluated by others in the room. The effectiveness of the friendly clarification also stems from its ability to force opponents into a defensive posture without appearing aggressive. When you attack someone's position directly, they can respond with equal force. But, when you claim to be simply clarifying their position, any forceful response seems disproportionate. They're left trying to explain subtle distinctions in meaning while you appear to be the one seeking genuine understanding. Part 2, The Mechanics of Psychological Dominance. As Machiavelli's understanding deepened through years of observing political discourse, he began to recognize patterns that went beyond individual techniques. He saw that the most effective arguers didn't just deploy isolated strategies, they understood how to create psychological conditions that made their opponents vulnerable to manipulation. The fourth strategy he identified exemplified this deeper understanding of human psychology in conflict situations. During the War of the League of Cambrai, Machiavelli found himself in Venice, observing negotiations between French and Venetian representatives over the terms of a potential alliance. The French ambassador, Guillaume Bude, faced the difficult task of convincing the Venetians to accept terms that were clearly disadvantageous to Venice. Yet through a technique Machiavelli came to call the false alternative, Bude managed to make the Venetians feel grateful for concessions that gave them far less than they had originally sought. The technique worked by presenting the opponent with a choice between two alternatives, both of which served your interests, while making it appear that you were offering them significant concessions. Bude began by outlining what he claimed were the French king's initial terms for the alliance, terms so harsh that they would have essentially reduced Venice to a French vassal state. The Venetian representatives were outraged, declaring such terms impossible to accept. Bude listened sympathetically to their objections, then withdrew to consult with his advisors. When he returned, he apologized for the severity of the initial terms and offered what he described as significant concessions he had managed to obtain from the king. These improved terms were still heavily favorable to France, but they seemed generous compared to the original proposal. The Venetians, relieved to avoid the disastrous first option, focused on how much better the second option was rather than comparing it to what a truly balanced alliance might look like. The psychological power of this strategy lies in its exploitation of the contrast effect, a fundamental quirk of human perception that causes us to evaluate options relative to available alternatives rather than against absolute standards. When presented with a terrible option followed by a merely bad option, people tend to feel positive about the merely bad option rather than recognizing it as undesirable in objective terms. Machiavelli realized that this technique could be applied far beyond formal negotiations. In any argument, you could present your opponent's position as leading to two possible outcomes, both negative, then position your own proposal as a reasonable middle ground. When someone argues for increased government regulation, you might first wonder whether they support the kind of totalitarian control seen in the most oppressive regimes, then express relief when they clarify that they only want moderate increases in oversight. Suddenly, their moderate position seems reasonable compared to the extremes you've conjured, even though those extremes were never actually under consideration. The key to executing this strategy effectively is to make the extreme alternative seem like a natural extension of your opponent's logic rather than an obvious straw man. You're not claiming they support the extreme position, you're expressing concern that their reasonable intentions might lead to extreme outcomes if taken to their logical conclusion. This apparent worry about unintended consequences makes your contrast seem thoughtful rather than manipulative. Bude's mastery was evident in how he framed the king's supposed initial position as the result of advisors who had misunderstood the situation, implying that he personally had fought to secure better terms for Venice. This created a sense of personal relationship and obligation that made the Venetians more willing to accept his improved offer. They felt they owed him something for his efforts on their behalf, even though those efforts had been entirely fictional. The fifth strategy emerged from Machiavelli's observation of how skilled politicians handled situations where they were caught in obvious contradictions or errors. Rather than deny the contradiction or attempt to explain it away, they employed what he termed the higher principle appeal. This technique involved acknowledging the apparent inconsistency while claiming that it resulted from adherence to a more important principle that transcended the specific issue at hand. Machiavelli witnessed this strategy during a confrontation between Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence, and members of the Signoria who accused him of reversing his position on a trade agreement with Genoa. Rather than deny the reversal or attempt to explain it through changed circumstances, Soderini acknowledged that his position had indeed evolved, but framed this evolution as evidence of his commitment to Florence's best interests above personal consistency. "You are correct that I have changed my view on this matter," Soderini said calmly. "6 months ago, I believed this agreement would serve our republic. Today, I believe it would harm our republic. You must decide whether you prefer leaders who stubbornly cling to positions that no longer serve our interests, or leaders who have the wisdom and humility to recognize when circumstances require new approaches. I have chosen to prioritize Florence's welfare over my personal reputation for consistency." This response transformed what appeared to be a liability, inconsistency, into evidence of virtue. Soderini wasn't flip-flopping, he was demonstrating the flexibility and responsiveness that good leadership required. His accusers found themselves in the awkward position of either appearing to value personal consistency over practical effectiveness, or accepting that his position change might indeed reflect admirable adaptability. The psychological power of this technique stems from its appeal to widely shared values that most people consider more important than the specific issue under debate. Nearly everyone agrees that principles like integrity, effectiveness, truth, justice, or the common good should take precedence over lesser considerations. By framing your apparent weakness as evidence of commitment to these higher principles, you force opponents to either challenge those principles, which makes them appear petty or unprincipled, or accept your reframing of the situation. The key to using this strategy effectively is selecting a higher principle that genuinely resonates with your audience and that can plausibly explain your position or behavior. The principle must be one that your opponents share and cannot reasonably attack without damaging their own credibility. When accused of changing your mind, you can appeal to intellectual honesty and the importance of following evidence wherever it leads. When accused of being inflexible, you can appeal to the importance of maintaining core values in a world of shifting fashions. Soderini's execution was particularly skillful because he didn't just invoke the principle abstractly, he forced his accusers to choose explicitly between competing values. This created a moment of moral clarity where opposing him meant opposing the principle he had invoked. Few politicians were willing to argue publicly that consistency mattered more than Florence's welfare, so his reframing effectively ended the attack. The sixth and most sophisticated strategy Machiavelli observed was also the most dangerous, requiring precise judgment about timing and audience. He called it the Socratic trap, after the ancient philosopher's method of exposing ignorance through careful questioning. However, Machiavelli's version was weaponized for competitive rather than educational purposes. The strategy involved asking a series of seemingly innocent questions that gradually led your opponent into a logical contradiction or an admission that undermined their original position. Unlike aggressive interrogation, this technique required patience and subtlety. The questions had to appear genuinely curious rather than hostile, and each question had to follow naturally from the previous answer. Machiavelli observed this technique during a debate in the Florentine councils over whether to impose new taxes on merchant guilds. Francesco Guicciardini, speaking against the proposal, faced strong opposition from guild representatives who argued that the taxes were necessary for city defenses. Rather than argue directly against the need for defense or the appropriateness of taxation, Guicciardini began with a simple question: which guilds do you believe contribute most to Florence's prosperity? The guild representatives eagerly described how their various crafts and trades formed the backbone of the city's economy. Guicciardini nodded approvingly and asked follow-up questions about specific contributions, drawing out detailed explanations of how guild activities generated wealth and employment. Then, he asked, and, when our guilds prosper, what effect does this have on Florence's overall strength and security? The representatives explained enthusiastically that prosperous guilds meant a prosperous Florence, which in turn meant a Florence capable of defending itself and projecting power. Guicciardini agreed completely, then asked, so the strength of our guilds directly contributes to our city's security? When they confirmed this obvious point, he paused thoughtfully and said, then, help me understand how weakening our guilds through additional taxation strengthens our defenses? If, as you've explained, guild prosperity is fundamental to Florentine power, wouldn't measures that reduce that prosperity ultimately undermine the very security we're trying to protect? The guild representatives found themselves trapped by their own logic. They had established that guild prosperity was essential to Florentine security, making it difficult to argue that reducing guild prosperity through taxation would enhance that same security. Guicciardini had used their own expertise and pride in their contributions to create the framework that ultimately undermined their position. The psychological power of this technique lies in its use of the opponent's own words and reasoning to create the contradiction. Because they have provided the premises, they cannot easily reject the conclusion without appearing illogical or dishonest. Moreover, because you've appeared genuinely interested in understanding their position, your final question seems like a natural attempt to reconcile apparent inconsistencies rather than an attack. The danger of this strategy is that it requires you to genuinely understand your opponent's position well enough to identify potential contradictions or weak points in their logic. If you misunderstand their argument or if their position is actually more consistent than you realized, you may find yourself helping them clarify and strengthen their case rather than undermining it. The technique also requires careful attention to audience reactions, as observers who notice the manipulative intent may react negatively to what appears to be intellectual dishonesty disguised as Socratic inquiry. Guicciardini's execution was masterful because he never appeared to be leading his opponents toward a predetermined conclusion. Each question seemed to arise naturally from genuine curiosity about the previous answer. When he posed his final question, it appeared to be an honest expression of confusion rather than a rhetorical trap. This made it difficult for his opponents to accuse him of manipulation without seeming paranoid or defensive. Part 3, The Architecture of Intellectual Dominance. The true genius of Machiavellian argument strategy, however, lay not in the individual techniques but in understanding how to combine them into systematic campaigns of intellectual dominance. Through years of observation and practice, Machiavelli recognized that the most devastating victories in discourse came from creating what he privately termed psychological checkmate situations where opponents found themselves unable to respond effectively regardless of their knowledge, preparation, or good intentions. The concept emerged from his analysis of a remarkable political debate that took place in 1512, during the crisis that would ultimately lead to his own fall from power. The Medici family, recently returned to Florence with papal and Spanish support, were consolidating their control over the Republic's institutions. In the critical council meeting that would determine whether Florence would maintain its republican constitution or submit to Medici rule, Machiavelli witnessed Giuliano de' Medici systematically dismantle the arguments of Florence's most capable republican defenders. Giuliano's performance was a masterpiece of strategic argumentation that combined all 6 techniques in a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to create cascading psychological pressure on his opponents. He began by employing the mirror of contradiction against the Republicans' passionate defense of liberty and self-governance. He expressed wholehearted agreement with their principles, then wondered aloud why, if they truly believed in the people's right to choose their own government, they were opposing the clear will of the Florentine citizenry, who had welcomed the Medici return with celebration and relief. When the Republicans protested that the people's welcome was coerced by foreign armies and did not represent genuine consent, Giuliano seamlessly shifted to the burden of proof reversal. He questioned whether true consent was even possible in political matters, asking them to explain how any government could claim legitimacy if popular approval obtained through any form of pressure, economic, social, or military, was considered invalid. Did they believe that the current Republican government, which maintained power through its own forms of influence and pressure, was somehow more legitimate than a Medici government that at least had the advantage of popular support, however, that support had been obtained? The Republicans found themselves forced to defend abstract theories of legitimate government rather than focusing on the concrete benefits of their existing institutions. As they struggled to articulate principles of consent and legitimacy that could distinguish their preferred system from Medici rule, Giuliano employed the friendly clarification to reframe their arguments in increasingly theoretical terms that seemed disconnected from practical governance concerns. When Republican Speaker Marco Strozzi argued that legitimate government required the free consent of citizens who understood their choices, Giuliano nodded thoughtfully and said, "So you're suggesting that most of our citizens are not qualified to make political decisions? That only those with sufficient education and understanding should participate in government?" When Strozzi protested that this wasn't his meaning, Giuliano appeared genuinely puzzled. "But, you've said that consent must be both free and informed. Surely that implies that uninformed consent is invalid?" "I'm simply trying to understand whether you believe all citizens are capable of providing the kind of consent you consider legitimate, or whether you think political participation should be limited to those who meet certain standards of knowledge and understanding." Through this clarification, Giuliano forced the Republicans into an impossible choice between democratic principles they had always supported and elitist implications they could never publicly embrace. Either Florentine citizens were capable of making legitimate political choices, in which case their support for Medici rule was valid, or they were not capable of such choices, in which case Republican government was itself illegitimate. As the Republicans struggled with this dilemma, Giuliano introduced the false alternative. He acknowledged that reasonable people could disagree about forms of government, but suggested that Florence faced only 2 realistic options given the current political situation. they could either accept Medici leadership and maintain Florence's independence and prosperity within the broader Italian political system, or they could continue to resist and face the inevitable military consequences of opposing both papal and Spanish power. He painted a vivid picture of what resistance would mean: foreign armies occupying the city, Florentine independence destroyed, the Republic's institutions dismantled by force rather than transformed through negotiation. Against this catastrophic alternative, Medici rule appeared not just acceptable but generous. Giuliano wasn't demanding surrender, he was offering partnership in preserving what could be saved of Florentine autonomy and prosperity. When several Republicans attempted to argue that other alternatives existed, seeking French support, forming alliances with other Italian republics, appealing to broader European powers, Giuliano employed the higher principle appeal. He didn't dispute the theoretical possibility of these alternatives, instead, he questioned whether gambling with Florence's survival was consistent with the fundamental responsibility of political leaders to protect their citizens. "You may be right that other options exist," he said solemnly. "But, you are asking us to bet our city's future, our citizens' lives, our republic's very existence on possibilities rather than certainties. Is this the kind of leadership Florence deserves? When we have an opportunity to secure our people's welfare and preserve our essential institutions through negotiation, is it wise or responsible to reject this opportunity in favor of strategies that might succeed but might also lead to complete destruction?" This reframing transformed opposition to Medici rule from principled resistance into reckless gambling with other people's lives. The Republicans found themselves cast as idealistic extremists willing to sacrifice practical welfare for abstract principles, while Giuliano appeared as the responsible moderate prioritizing concrete benefits for real people. Finally, as the debate reached its climax, Giuliano deployed the Socratic trap with devastating effectiveness. He began by asking the Republicans to explain what specific benefits the current Republican institutions provided to ordinary Florentines that would be lost under Medici leadership. As they enumerated various freedoms, protections, and opportunities, he listened carefully and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their answers. Then, he asked whether these benefits depended more on particular institutional structures or on having leaders committed to Florentine welfare. When they insisted that institutions mattered more than individual leaders, he wondered how they explained the success of well-governed monarchies and principalities throughout Europe, or the failures of various republics that had collapsed into chaos and corruption despite having proper constitutional frameworks. "Help me understand," he said with apparent confusion, "how institutional structures can guarantee good government if they depend on good people to operate them, but good people cannot provide good government if they lack proper institutional structures? If institutions are only as good as the people who run them, and if the Medici family has demonstrated both competence and commitment to Florence's welfare, why would changing institutional forms matter more than ensuring competent and committed leadership?" The Republicans realized too late that they had been led into defending an abstract theory of institutional determinism that their own examples had already undermined. They had admitted that institutions required good people to function effectively, making it difficult to argue that keeping existing institutions mattered more than securing good leadership, regardless of the formal structure of that leadership. Through this systematic dismantling of Republican arguments, Giuliano achieved something more profound than victory in a single debate. He had demonstrated the complete intellectual superiority of the Medici position by showing that every line of Republican reasoning led ultimately to contradictions, impossibilities, or unacceptable consequences. The Republicans were not just wrong, they were incapable of constructing coherent arguments for their position when confronted with careful analysis. This psychological devastation proved more effective than any direct attack on Republican principles or any assertion of Medici rights. By allowing his opponents to speak freely and, then, systematically exposing the flaws in their reasoning, Giuliano made opposition to Medici rule appear not just politically unwise but intellectually untenable. Observers could see for themselves that the Republic's defenders could not provide satisfactory answers to reasonable questions about their own position. The broader lesson Machiavelli drew from this performance was that true mastery in argument required understanding discourse as psychological warfare rather than cooperative inquiry into truth. The goal was not to discover the best answer to political questions, but to establish intellectual dominance that would make opposition psychologically impossible for reasonable people. This understanding led him to recognize that the most sophisticated arguers operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, they appeared to engage in normal debate, presenting evidence, making logical points, responding to objections. But, underneath, they were systematically undermining their opponent's confidence, credibility, and cognitive resources. The techniques worked by creating what modern psychologists would recognize as cognitive overload. When opponents had to simultaneously defend their original position, respond to reframings and extensions of their arguments, justify fundamental assumptions they had never questioned, choose between false alternatives, explain apparent contradictions in their logic, and maintain emotional composure under intellectual pressure, their thinking became less clear and their responses less effective. Moreover, the techniques exploited social dynamics that made it difficult for opponents to respond effectively even when they recognized what was happening. Directly accusing a skilled practitioner of manipulation often backfired, making the accuser appear paranoid or unable to engage with substantive arguments. Attempting to ignore the techniques and return to original points made the opponent appear evasive or unable to address legitimate questions and concerns. The cumulative effect was to create situations where skilled arguers could maintain intellectual credibility while systematically destroying their opponent's positions. They appeared reasonable, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in understanding different viewpoints, while their opponents appeared confused, defensive, and unable to provide coherent answers to legitimate questions. Machiavelli realized that this level of argumentative skill represented a form of soft power that could be more effective than traditional forms of coercion. When people were defeated in argument through techniques that appeared fair and reasonable, they often internalized their defeat, coming to believe that their original positions had indeed been flawed rather than recognizing that they had been outmaneuvered through superior psychological tactics. This internalization made the victory more durable than victories achieved through obvious manipulation or force. People who had been intellectually dominated often became advocates for the positions that had defeated them, having been convinced that these positions were simply more logical and well-reasoned than their own previous beliefs. The ultimate sophistication of Machiavellian argument strategy lay in its creation of what appeared to be genuine intellectual inquiry while actually serving predetermined political purposes. The techniques could be deployed by people who sincerely believed in their positions and genuinely thought they were seeking truth through rational discourse. The manipulation was often unconscious, making it more natural and, therefore, more persuasive. This insight led Machiavelli to a darker understanding of human discourse itself. He began to suspect that all political argument was essentially manipulative, that the appearance of rational inquiry was always at least partly a mask for the exercise of power. The techniques he had identified were simply more conscious and systematic versions of psychological maneuvers that people employed instinctively in competitive situations. From this perspective, mastery of argumentative strategy was not about abandoning honest discourse in favor of manipulation, but about developing conscious skill in dynamics that operated unconsciously in all human interaction. The choice was not between pure reason and psychological manipulation, but between naive vulnerability to others' unconscious manipulations and sophisticated awareness of how discourse actually functioned as a form of social combat. This understanding would profoundly influence Machiavelli's later political philosophy, leading him toward the pragmatic realism that characterized The Prince and his other mature works. He came to believe that effective political action required abandoning idealistic assumptions about human nature and social interaction in favor of hard-headed recognition of the psychological and social forces that actually shaped political outcomes. The 6 strategies he had identified represented not just techniques for winning arguments, but insights into fundamental aspects of human psychology that determine success or failure in all forms of social competition. Understanding these dynamics was essential for anyone seeking to exercise influence or resist the influence of others in political, professional, or personal contexts. Yet Machiavelli also recognized the moral ambiguity of such knowledge. The same techniques that could be used to manipulate people into supporting harmful policies could also be used to guide them toward beneficial ones. The psychological insights that enabled demagogues to mislead populations could also help genuine reformers overcome irrational resistance to necessary changes. The ultimate question was not whether to use such techniques, since their unconscious use was unavoidable in competitive discourse, but how to use them responsibly and effectively in service of worthwhile goals. This required not just technical skill in argumentative strategy, but wisdom in choosing when and how to deploy such techniques in ways that served the broader good rather than narrow self-interest. In the end, Machiavelli's analysis of argument strategy revealed something profound about the nature of human social interaction itself. Beneath the surface of rational discourse lay deeper currents of psychological manipulation, social dominance, and emotional persuasion that shaped outcomes more powerfully than logical reasoning or factual evidence. Understanding these currents was essential for anyone seeking to navigate complex social environments effectively. Whether in the political arena, the business world, or personal relationships, the ability to recognize and respond to sophisticated argumentative strategies could mean the difference between success and failure, between achieving worthwhile goals and falling victim to others' manipulations. The 6 strategies, the mirror of contradiction, the burden of proof reversal, the friendly clarification, the false alternative, the higher principle appeal, and the Socratic trap, provided a framework for understanding how discourse functioned as a form of soft power. They revealed how apparent reasonableness could mask systematic manipulation, how the structure of conversation itself could be weaponized, and how psychological pressure could be applied through techniques that maintained plausible intellectual respectability. Most importantly, they demonstrated that true mastery in human discourse required understanding not just logic and evidence, but the deeper psychological and social dynamics that determined how logic and evidence would be received, interpreted, and acted upon by real people in competitive situations. This understanding represented a form of practical wisdom that could be applied across all domains of human interaction, providing tools for both offense and defense in the endless competition for influence that characterized social life. The legacy of Machiavelli's insights extends far beyond the specific historical context in which they were developed. In our contemporary world of political debate, business negotiation, legal advocacy, and social media discourse, the same fundamental dynamics continue to operate. The techniques may be adapted to new media and contexts, but the underlying psychological principles remain constant. Recognition of these principles provides both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity lies in developing more sophisticated understanding of how communication actually functions in competitive environments, enabling more effective pursuit of worthwhile goals and more successful resistance to harmful manipulations. The responsibility lies in using such understanding wisely, recognizing that the power to influence others through sophisticated discourse carries ethical obligations that extend beyond narrow self-interest. In the centuries since Machiavelli first observed these patterns in Renaissance political discourse, they have been refined and systematized by generations of politicians, lawyers, negotiators, and scholars. Yet the fundamental insights remain as relevant today as they were in the marble halls of Florence 500 years ago. Understanding how discourse functions as a form of power remains essential knowledge for anyone seeking to navigate complex social environments effectively and ethically. The art of argument, as Machiavelli discovered, is ultimately the art of human influence itself. Mastery of this art requires not just intellectual understanding, but practical wisdom in knowing when and how to deploy sophisticated techniques in service of worthwhile goals. This wisdom remains as crucial today as it was in Machiavelli's time, perhaps more so in our interconnected world where the power of discourse to shape reality has been amplified by technology and global communication networks. The 6 strategies he identified provide a foundation for developing such wisdom, offering tools for understanding and responding to the psychological dynamics that shape all human discourse. Whether used for offense or defense, in pursuit of noble goals or in resistance to harmful manipulations, these techniques represent essential knowledge for anyone seeking to exercise influence responsibly and effectively in our complex social world.